All right. To everyone drawn to the eerie, the unsettling, and the downright unexplainable, you're in the right place. If you live for stories that send chills racing down your spine and linger in your thoughts long after the lights go out, then get comfortable, because this one hits different. Before we dive in, I've got to ask, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it on your end? The stories. The bus route no driver volunteers for anymore. Mason Kiernan had heard about Route 74 from older drivers, who spoke in quiet tones that never carried far. They said the trouble started in the late 2010s after a strange series of reports reached dispatch. Nothing dramatic was proven, yet every account shared the same route and the same stretch of road. Mason was 34, with 6 years on the job, and he handled his shifts without much worry. He covered suburban loops near a quiet industrial strip, and most days followed a predictable pattern. He enjoyed the routine since it felt steady and harmless. When his supervisor asked him to cover Route 74 one cloudy afternoon, he agreed before he remembered the warnings. He showed up early at the depot that day, hoping to review the old logbooks stored in a dusty metal drawer near the operations office. The previous drivers had left short notes that felt rushed and uneasy. One entry from late 2016 mentioned a recorded thump on the rear exterior panel that matched no visible damage. Another entry filed in early 2018 reported an unknown passenger leaving muddy prints that ended halfway down the aisle. Mason drove out a little before 4 that afternoon. The route crossed through residential blocks before curving toward the old mill road that ran along an abandoned railway cut. He planned to complete the loop without focusing on the rumors. The bus felt solid, and the passengers were few. A pair of teenagers sat near the middle seats while an elderly man checked his phone with slow movements. The incident started as Mason merged onto the mill road. His side mirror reflected something darker than the usual late daylight. He caught a shape near the tree line that looked like a person leaning slightly forward. When he blinked, the shape was gone. He told himself it was nothing unusual, since shadows often stretched strangely near wooded areas. Still, he noticed the elderly man glancing toward the same window, as if he had sensed something too. A mile later, the teenagers hit the stop cord. Mason opened the doors, and they stepped out onto a fading concrete pad. As the doors shut, one of them tapped the glass and pointed toward the rear of the bus. Mason reversed the angle of his mirror and saw a smear across the lower panel. It looked wet, like someone dragged a hand along the metal. He checked the road behind him and saw no one there. The teenagers shrugged before walking away. Mason continued toward the loop turn, focusing on the sound of the engine. The noise seemed slightly off-pitch. He kept his speed steady, but sensed a weight shift near the rear section. The elderly passenger moved closer and asked if everything was all right. Mason told him the engine felt warm but stable. The man nodded and mentioned hearing a hollow tapping near the back wall. At the final stop of the loop, the elderly man stepped out, leaving Mason alone for the return run. He checked the exterior panel and found the smear dry like dust pressed by a damp glove. The shape continued a few inches beyond the edge, as if the contact started slightly off the surface. He wiped it with his sleeve and felt grainy residue flake away with an odd metallic smell. He climbed back inside and started the engine. The interior lights flickered once as the gear engaged. He made it halfway up the hill before a heavy thud sounded near the emergency exit. He braked and listened. Another softer thud followed, like something shifting its weight. He walked down the aisle with slow steps and checked each row. The seats were empty, and the air felt colder than it should for that hour. Near the back seat, he noticed a set of partial prints on the floor. They were narrower than a normal shoe, but shaped like someone walking with uneven pressure. The prints stopped exactly where previous notes claimed they ended. He crouched low and found a fragment of dried soil that did not match the usual clay from the area. It held a reddish tint closer to iron dust from the old mill yard. Mason reached dispatch through the radio and reported the noises. The operator told him to return the bus for inspection, since archived calls from earlier years mentioned similar sounds. He kept the radio open as he returned to the wheel. The air inside felt charged, like static gathering before a storm. On the way back, he passed the same hill where he had seen the shadow near the trees. The mirror caught movement again. This time, he saw a figure standing perfectly still on the narrow shoulder. The figure wore something loose that blended with the background. The face seemed pale, though he could not see details clearly. The figure vanished between glances without any sign of retreat. A minute later, a faint tapping started along the rear exterior. It rose in 3 short bursts that matched a steady rhythm. He recognized a pattern similar to someone hitting metal to test thickness. He held the wheel tight and kept driving until the depot gates came into view. Mechanics met him near the garage. They checked the exterior and found thin scratches near the rear panel that shaped a curved line not caused by branches. The residue he had wiped earlier fell into a small tray and produced a metallic odor stronger than before. One mechanic mentioned that earlier logs described identical residue after drivers reported seeing a lone figure near the mill road in late 2017. The supervisor asked Mason to retrace the interior for any objects left behind. He searched each row with a handheld light. Near the same spot where the prints ended, he found a torn strip of cloth hanging from the seat frame. It felt oddly cold, even under the warm light. The cloth carried the same reddish tint as the soil fragment. Later that night, the depot reviewed old dash recordings from previous years. Most footage showed nothing more than faint reflections. However, one clip from mid-2019 captured a blurred outline moving along the side of a passing bus. The outline kept pace for several seconds before fading near the same hill where Mason saw the figure. Investigators compared the footage with archived local reports. They found mention of a worker who disappeared near the mill site in late 2015. The report never confirmed foul play, and the search ended without results. There was no official link connecting that case to the strange events on the route, yet the timing matched the earliest driver notes. Mason stayed quiet as the supervisor reviewed the findings. The bus still sat idling with a low rumble that hummed through the concrete floor. A mechanic tapped the rear panel and noted that the metal vibrated oddly like a surface recently struck from the outside. Another mechanic mentioned hearing a faint echo that felt delayed by half a second. The depot decided to suspend Route 74 until the buses could be tested. Drivers whispered that the figure near the hill might be tied to the worker who vanished years earlier. No one claimed solid proof, yet the pattern of sightings, sounds, and residue lined up too closely to ignore. The supervisor circulated a memo explaining that the route posed operational risks due to repeated, unexplained interference. Mason drove home that night feeling the weight of everything he had seen. He replayed the moment when the figure appeared in the mirror. He tried to decide if it looked like a person seeking help or a shape formed by shifting shadows. The cloth fragment still felt cold in his memory, though he never touched it again. In the weeks after the suspension, several commuters asked why the route closed. Officials told them the road required maintenance due to instability near the railway cut. Only a few people mentioned the old rumors. Some said they once saw someone walking the hill at dusk, though none described a clear face. Mason returned to his regular loop and kept his focus on safe runs. He never requested Route 74 again. Whenever the topic surfaced among drivers, he listened quietly without adding his story. He knew what he had heard and seen on that road. He also knew that the evidence, while thin, repeated across years with unsettling consistency. The depot finally retired the buses assigned to that route. They stored them in a corner lot away from the main garage. On calm nights, staff claimed to hear soft taps on the panels as if something moved inside the old shells. No one investigated because the sound stopped whenever a door opened. Each time Mason passed the lot, he felt a chill rise along his arms. He believed the events were real, even if no official report could confirm them. Route 74 remained closed, and no driver stepped forward to revive it. The story faded from public view, yet those who worked at the depot understood why the route stayed empty. They remembered how it felt to sense a presence following the bus, and they knew some roads carry histories that never fully settle. The nurse who refused to enter Room 6 again. Lila Farnes first heard about Room 6 through a short entry in an old staffing report that mentioned unusual overnight disruptions. The report was dated to 2009 and came from a small regional clinic that sat outside a quiet town with limited medical resources. Lila was 33 and worked as a traveling nurse who filled short contracts in understaffed facilities. She arrived at the clinic during early autumn when the halls felt calm and the night shift moved slowly through predictable routines. Her simple goal that week was to keep a steady rhythm while saving money for a move planned for the next spring. On her second night, she was assigned a rotation that included Room 6, which held a recovering patient named Dorian Pike. He was 62 with a mild respiratory issue that required observation but posed no immediate danger. His chart suggested stable progress, which meant the room should have been an easy stop during her quiet rounds. The incident began when Lila stepped inside the room and noticed a faint tapping sound that seemed to come from the wall near the bed. The patient had been awake, and he watched her with an uneasy expression that suggested he wanted to speak but hesitated. She asked if he needed anything, and he answered with a flat, "Please keep the lights on tonight," which struck her as odd, given his preference for darkness noted earlier by the day nurse. During her next pass, the tapping returned and felt sharper, like something struck the wall with steady intent. Lila checked the hallway and found nothing unusual beyond a supply cart resting near a closed door. She reviewed maintenance notes later and saw that workers had previously inspected the wall after a similar complaint in 2006, yet found no loose utilities or structural issues. The complication deepened when a nurse on the shift before hers mentioned archived calls made by former night staff. Those calls reportedly described patient distress related to sudden cold drafts that moved through room 6 even when vents were shut. Lila filed this in her mind, but kept her focus on what she could directly verify, which meant returning to the room with a calm approach and simple checks. When she entered again, she saw Dorian clutching the call button with both hands and staring at the same wall that had produced the tapping. He whispered, "They move through here," which confused her because he had no history of disorientation and his oxygen levels looked normal. She tried reassuring him, but he pointed toward a small framed print that hung crooked like someone had pushed it earlier. Lila documented the scene, then stepped into the hallway to compare notes with the evening charge nurse named Brenton Shaw. He was in his late 40s and had worked the clinic for many years, which gave him perspective on long-standing issues. Brenton admitted that room 6 had frequent incident logs related to unexplained noise, but he never saw anything dangerous, so he kept assignments unchanged. The investigation began after Dorian reported that someone had touched his arm during a period when no staff had entered the room. Lila checked the security panel near the nurse's station, which showed timestamps for door openings captured by the badge sensor. The logs indicated her previous visit, followed by a long gap with no recorded entry, which made his claim puzzling. She then reviewed older patient notes from 2003 to 2008, which described brief episodes of agitation from individuals with no history of anxiety. Several mentioned hearing movement behind the wall near the bed, and one wrote that a picture frame had tilted during a quiet stretch. These details were small but consistent, which encouraged her to look for a physical explanation. Lila asked the maintenance lead named Corbin Rusk to inspect the wall after her shift ended. He brought a handheld thermal scanner and ran it across the surface while she watched from the doorway. The tool showed a thin vertical band of cooler temperature that did not match the building layout, which suggested an unregistered cavity or narrow chase behind the drywall. Corbin returned during daylight with a small borescope camera designed to look behind tight spaces. He located a hidden seam in the corner that had been painted over during earlier renovations. When he guided the camera inside, they saw a slender gap between structural supports where unsecured pipes ran without proper insulation, which explained both the cold drafts and the intermittent tapping. The twist emerged when Corbin followed the pipes farther and discovered that the cavity connected to an abandoned service chase sealed decades earlier, according to archived renovation notes. That chase once linked several rooms, including room 6, where older patients had repeatedly complained about footsteps at night. The noise likely traveled along the hollow space and grew sharper as the building shifted during temperature changes. Lila returned to Dorian with the findings, which eased his fear because it gave something concrete to replace earlier uncertainty. She watched him relax when she explained how air moved through the gap and how small vibrations struck the wall during normal settling. He nodded and said, "That makes more sense than what I thought," which helped restore predictable routines for the rest of his stay. The payoff became clear a few days later when the clinic sealed the gap with proper insulation, which stopped the tapping that had bothered so many night staff over the years. Lila felt relieved because the solution fit every clue she had gathered from logs, witness comments, and earlier maintenance records. She no longer feared the room and worked her shifts without hesitation. Still, she remembered the moment she first stepped into room 6 and sensed tension that felt older than her short assignment. She knew many stories deepen when fearful people misread unfamiliar sounds, but she also understood how convincing those moments can feel. Later, she often said that small mysteries usually shrink under steady checking and clear evidence, which matched her experience at the clinic. Lila finished her contract without further issues and moved to her next job carrying a quiet confidence shaped by those nights. She still thought about Dorian and the relief in his voice after learning the real cause behind the unsettling moments. Room 6 stayed sealed and silent after the repairs, which meant future patients would sleep without wondering what moved behind the wall. The stories. Never open the locker marked staff only at this pool. It was reported that an old community pool kept one locker sealed during every shift, which matched the warning painted on its door. Local staff claimed the warning came from an incident in the early 2010s that never made public records. On a warm morning in late July 2019, a 28-year-old lifeguard named Rylan Keene started his first full weekend shift. He worked part-time at the pool while finishing a safety certification course, and he had a simple plan that day. He wanted to close early, finish his paperwork, and head home before the evening rush. The pool sat near a quiet suburb, and most regular visitors arrived with kids who stayed close to the shallow end. Rylan checked the schedule board, then walked along the lockers behind the staff counter while sipping a cheap canned coffee. He noticed a metal locker that looked older than the rest, and its front carried the words "Staff Only" in faded red paint. The manager had already mentioned the locker during training, stating that nobody should open it since the last documented key went missing years earlier. Reports from retired employees suggested the door once belonged to the maintenance area, although the structure behind it had been remodeled in 2008. Rylan always thought the story was exaggerated to keep kids from sneaking inside. That morning, he heard a dull rattle from the locker, which felt unusual since no one stored equipment there. He tapped the metal surface with two knuckles and heard something shift inside. He looked around the empty hallway and said quietly, "Anyone stuck in there?" which made no sense because the locker was too narrow for a person. The sound stopped, then a faint thud followed, which tightened the idea that maybe an animal had crawled in through the back. Rylan fetched a flashlight from the front desk and returned to inspect the vent near the locker base. Dust coated the grate, and nothing suggested active airflow. He crouched lower but noticed a small slip of paper on the floor, folded twice with the edges stiff from moisture. It looked recently placed and carried a quick note reading, "Check logs before closing time." The handwriting looked rushed, and he recognized none of the staff who wrote like that. He placed the note in his pocket and opened the office drawer where old incident binders were kept. The logs from 2011 through 2014 were thin, while the binder labeled 2015 through 2017 held several handwritten entries from night shifts. One entry from late August 2015 described a report of heavy knocking from behind the old locker. The guard wrote that he radioed a supervisor, then waited 15 minutes before the noise stopped. Another entry from early June 2017 mentioned a staffer who claimed to hear a voice calling for help from inside the wall. The supervisor at the time marked both events as unverified due to limited evidence. Rylan read further and found an archived maintenance note claiming the original access hallway behind the locker had been closed after a small structural collapse in 2010. Workers sealed the area with sheet metal and advised future crews to avoid disturbing it. The description matched the dimensions of the locker, so it seemed the locker mostly existed to cover the patch. Before he could finish the binder, a regular swimmer named Tala Pembry approached the desk to ask about the lap lane schedule. She was in her 40s and visited nearly every morning. She noticed the binder and said, "You checking the old disturbance files," which caught him by surprise because he had not mentioned anything. She explained that she swam here in 2010 when the collapse happened. She remembered a construction light falling behind the wall and a worker yelling that someone was still inside the hallway. Tala claimed she never heard what happened afterward, and she said the staff acted nervous for weeks. Rylan asked what she remembered about the worker. She paused, then said, "He was young, maybe early 20s, before walking toward the changing rooms." Her voice shook slightly, as if she had debated sharing more. He returned to the hallway with the locker and listened again. There was no sound now, only the faint buzz of old fluorescent bulbs. He reached for the handle and felt a cold vibration that did not match the ambient temperature. He stepped back and considered calling the manager, but he knew the manager would say it was nothing more than old pipes. Rylan spent the next hour monitoring the pool and checking the locker during each sweep. At 2 in the afternoon, the note in his pocket felt heavier somehow. He unfolded it again and noticed that the ink looked smeared, almost as if the message had been written minutes earlier rather than hours ago. He checked the front desk computer for any digital archive of maintenance calls near that structure. The system showed a report from 2019, only 4 months old, where a staff member logged hearing metal scraping behind the locker. The entry stated that the scraping stopped when they stepped closer. Later that afternoon, an older groundskeeper named Ward Leston entered the office to collect spare filters. Ward had worked there for more than 15 years and kept a quiet personality. Ryland decided to ask him directly about the locker. Ward froze for a second, then said, "Leave that alone. Someone got hurt behind that door long ago, and the place never settled right." He refused to explain further and left with the filters without another word. With every hour passing, the hallway felt heavier, as if the air thickened around the locker. Around 5:30, the pool emptied, and a soft tapping came from the metal door. Ryland tightened his grip on the flashlight and said, "If there is an animal inside, I have to check before closing." The tapping shifted into a sliding sound, as if something moved downward. He leaned close and whispered, "Do you need help?" which felt ridiculous, but came out naturally. To his shock, a weak voice answered through the thin panel. It sounded like a scared young man saying, "I am stuck in the hall," followed by a strained cough. Ryland jumped back, then approached again and said, "I will get help. Stay calm." He ran toward the maintenance shed and grabbed a crowbar, then returned with his pulse racing. He wedged the tool under the corner and pried, expecting the metal to bend easily. Instead, the locker door lifted sharply on its own, almost like someone had tugged it from the inside. A sharp burst of cold air hit his face as the door cracked open by less than an inch. He pointed the flashlight through the gap and saw a narrow cavity behind the metal panel. It looked like an old service corridor lined with dusty concrete. At the far end, he spotted a reflective surface that resembled a safety vest, and the faint voice called again, saying, "Please pull me out." The corridor seemed impossibly deep compared to the thickness of the wall, which caused him to recoil in confusion. Seconds later, his radio crackled by itself with heavy static that drowned all pool noise. The corridor darkened as if an unseen shadow moved closer, and the vest shape disappeared completely. The voice stopped mid-sentence, and the temperature dropped sharply, making his arms shake. He stepped backward, and the locker door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the empty hallway. He tried the handle again, but it would not budge, and the flashlight died without warning. He backed away and held his breath as the building settled. No further sounds came from the locker. Dispatch logs later stated that he reported the incident at 6:10 in the evening, though the call lasted only 9 seconds before the line failed. Management inspected the locker the next morning, but found no evidence of a corridor or any exposed space. They claimed the interior showed only plywood backing and sealed insulation. Ryland insisted on what he saw, but the staff reminded him that the structure behind the locker had been permanently filled. He wrote a full report, which was stored with older, unexplained events. Weeks later, a former construction worker visited the pool to repair a broken gate. When Ryland described the voice, the worker asked if it sounded like a man named Astor Holt, who went missing during the 2010 collapse. Records suggested he entered the service hall before the accident, though recovery teams never found him. The worker whispered that some crews believed the hall never sealed completely, and the pool carried echoes from that gap. Ryland eventually left the job, but he kept the original folded note as uneasy proof of that day. The locker remains bolted shut, and new staff are told the same warning he once ignored. Some visitors claim they still hear tapping near closing time, though it stops the moment anyone acknowledges it. For anyone walking those quiet hallways, the warning on the locker remains clear. Never open the locker marked staff only at this pool. The stories. Why the police sealed off this roadside chapel. The small roadside chapel sat near a quiet county highway where drivers sometimes stopped during long rural trips. Local deputies reportedly closed it in late 2019 after a traveler found something that changed the tone around the place. The building was simple, and people usually barely noticed it. The story centered on a 34-year-old maintenance surveyor named Corbin Hale, who often drove that route for work. He lived in a nearby town, and he usually kept to a steady schedule that involved checking rural drainage markers along the highway. On a mild afternoon in late September of that year, he planned to finish early so he could meet a friend for dinner. He stopped near the chapel because one of the markers behind it looked slanted, and he wanted to document it. He walked toward the spot while carrying a small camera and a work notebook. The chapel door stood slightly open, and he remembered hearing nothing except distant traffic. He planned to ignore the building until he heard a short tapping sound from inside. The sound made him pause, and he stepped closer to check if someone needed help. He called out a quick greeting but got no answer, which felt strange considering the soft tapping kept going. He pushed the door with his boot and saw dust drifting through a bright slant of late daylight. A wooden bench near the front looked recently moved because its legs scraped fresh lines across the floor. The tapping came from deeper inside the room, which held only simple furniture and a small cross fixed above a shelf. Corbin noticed a backpack sitting beside the far wall, which did not belong to anyone he had seen earlier. He stepped in and recorded a short clip on his camera to document the scene. The tapping stopped once he moved toward the backpack. He felt uneasy, which he later described in a written statement to deputies. He returned outside and found a driver who had pulled over to check a map. That driver, named Rhea Dunford, told police she had been there roughly 10 minutes and saw no one enter or exit the chapel. She agreed to wait while Corbin called the non-emergency line to report an unattended bag because he worried about possible travelers who might need help. Deputies arrived 20 minutes later, according to their logs, and inspected the chapel with measured caution. Inside the bag, they found a wallet and an old flip phone plus a folded printed photo of the chapel. The photo looked like it had been taken years earlier because the paint on the door in that image was a different shade. The wallet held no cards, and the phone battery was nearly dead, but it powered on long enough for one deputy to see 3 saved video clips. Those clips showed brief shots of the chapel interior taken during different seasons, which suggested someone had visited repeatedly. In each clip, a bench had been moved to a different spot, and in the final clip, a faint figure appeared reflected in the small window which faced the highway. Deputies later said the figure looked like a person crouched near the bench, though the image lacked clarity. Investigators reviewed old repair records for the chapel, which belonged to a small regional trust that handled forgotten roadside structures built decades earlier. The trust produced a file showing a volunteer caretaker named Myron Keats, who went missing in early 2009 during a routine supply run. His last note mentioned stopping at the chapel to drop off paint. No clear link existed between his disappearance and the backpack, except the printed photo which matched the photography style in a few older trust documents. Investigators searched local archives for any reported visits after his disappearance and found a single entry in 2015 from a driver who claimed to see a man moving a bench inside at dusk. That report named no suspect, and the driver never returned follow-up calls. Deputies used the phone clips to frame their timeline and interviewed residents who passed through the area before the chapel closure. One witness, named Avery Lorne, recalled seeing a tired-looking man near the highway in early 2017 carrying what seemed like paint supplies. She described him as quiet and focused on the chapel path. Her statement matched the trust note, which strengthened the idea that someone remained connected to the building for years. Investigators also compared the fresh scrape marks on the floor with older photos taken by trust volunteers. Those older photos showed the bench in fixed positions, which suggested someone had moved it repeatedly in recent months. This supported the idea that the visitor returned long after Myron disappeared. When they completed their review, they sealed the chapel for safety because they believed an unknown person had been sheltering there. The person possibly struggled with memory issues or untreated fear of being found, according to one unofficial summary shared with Corbin. They suspected the tapping sound came from the bench shifting under slight pressure, which fit with his description. The unknown visitor was never located, and no missing person report perfectly matched the wallet photo, though the style resembled a younger Myron. Authorities kept the case open, but treated it as a possible long-term wandering situation rather than foul play. Corbin later told friends that the chapel felt different when he drove past on later surveys. He thought about the way small, forgotten places can hold tangled stories that no one fully understands. He believed the closure made sense because it protected whoever might return, as well as anyone who stopped without knowing the hidden history. He still remembered the tapping sound and considered it a reminder that quiet places often carry quiet warnings. The stories. The fisherman who kept hearing his name over the radio. Evan Carr spent most mornings on the narrow inlet where the water carried old radio chatter from nearby boats. Local crews reported that odd transmissions sometimes drifted through that stretch, and many believed they came from abandoned gear left after storms. He treated those stories like tired dock rumors until one calm morning changed his thinking. Evan was 38 and worked as a small-scale fisherman who supplied a few markets inland. He kept his aluminum skiff tied near the inlet because the currents stayed gentle and the tides rarely pushed hard. He headed out around sunrise on a day in early summer 2019 with a simple goal to check crab pots he set the night before. He liked the quiet and usually ignored the static coming from his battered radio. He started the motor, then steered toward his first buoy, while soft wind pushed light ripples across the inlet. He reached for his thermos when the radio cracked with a burst sharper than usual, which made him pause. Static hissed for several seconds, then a faint voice said his name with a slow, careful tone. It sounded like a person trying to speak through heavy interference. Evan thought it came from a nearby boat because signals often bounced across the water in unpredictable ways. He looked around but saw empty shoreline and one distant trawler that was already moving toward deeper water. The voice repeated his name with the same drawn-out sound, and he felt a sudden cold weight that did not match the warm morning. He tried to answer, but the radio only returned a faint hum that flicked in and out like something powered by a weak battery. He shut the radio off to reset it, then turned it back on, hoping the strange signal would vanish. Instead, he heard a low, rhythmic tapping that reminded him of someone hitting a metal hull in slow, measured beats. Evan finished checking the first pot, but his focus kept drifting to the radio because the voice carried a dull echo that felt unnatural. He tied the pot and planned to finish the rest quickly so he could return to shore where he hoped to test the antenna. The moment he reached for the throttle, the radio shifted again and whispered his name in a tone that sounded closer than before. He headed towards shore while replaying that voice in his mind because it carried an uneasy familiarity he could not place. Dock workers later said he arrived faster than usual and looked tense as he pulled his gear onto the planks. He asked if any boat had called for him that morning, but no one reported a transmission with his name. Evan returned home and wrote down the time of each strange broadcast because he wanted to check older notes he kept on similar events. He found 2 entries from early spring that mentioned brief whispers through the radio shortly after heavy fog settled over the inlet. He ignored them at the time because the fog distorted signals and created odd echoes that bounced between cliffs. He spent the afternoon checking online forums that tracked regional marine frequencies where enthusiasts archived recordings from previous seasons. One contributor posted a thread about ghost transmissions that came from a derelict trawler that sank in the late 2010s after a major storm. According to the thread, the trawler carried a short-range radio that sometimes flickered on during low tide when exposed wiring reacted to saltwater. Witness statements from local patrol crews reported faint voices calling crew names during those periods, though no identity was ever confirmed. Evan noted that detail because the thread mentioned distorted speech patterns that matched his morning experience. He called a friend named Cal Rowan, who worked part-time with a small rescue group, and asked if the inlet held any wrecks near his route. Cal said an old survey map showed one submerged boat that rested near the deeper bend south of the inlet. He offered to meet Evan at the dock so they could check tidal charts and mark the likely location. They met near sunset and compared notes while a light breeze pushed the smell of seaweed across the planks. Cal studied Evan's written times, then said the pattern lined up with a recent series of reports about intermittent transmissions during rising tide. He suggested they record any new signal the next morning using a portable device with stronger range than Evan's aging radio. Evan agreed, even though the idea made him uneasy because the voice felt personal in a way he could not explain. Morning arrived with heavy gray sky as they motored toward the bend marked on the survey map. Evan turned on the recorder while Cal monitored the radio and watched the water shift with the incoming tide. They waited for several minutes before a burst of static cracked through the speaker with a sharp rise that made both men flinch. The voice spoke again and said Evan's name with a tone that now carried a clipped urgency. Cal looked at the recorder, then stared toward the bend because the voice sounded as if it came from somewhere below the surface. Evan gripped the wheel and tried to steady his breathing because something in the tone reminded him of an old coworker who vanished years earlier during a late-season crossing. He mentioned that coworker to Cal, who asked if the man ever sailed near this inlet. Evan said that the coworker named Reed had worked on a small crew that fished along the same coastline in early 2017. Reed later transferred to another vessel that sank during a storm that occurred north of their town. Local reports said the wreck was never fully recovered because shifting sand made the search difficult. Cal suggested they check archived dispatch logs from that storm because crews sometimes reported drifting debris that could help them understand how anything connected to Reed might reach this inlet. They returned to shore and visited a small office where a retired dispatcher kept scanned records from older calls. The dispatcher recognized Evan and allowed them to search a digital folder that stored logs from early 2017. One log described a partial sighting of a damaged trawler hull drifting south several days after the storm. The report said the hull carried broken antennas and fragments of a radio panel that still flickered when exposed to sunlight. A second log mentioned a patrol officer hearing a distant voice through static that repeated a crew name before fading. Evan realized the name in that report matched Reed's last name, but the log did not mention if the voice said anything else. He remembered that Reed had a habit of calling coworkers by last name during early morning shifts when he tried to stay awake. The connection felt loose but too strong to ignore because the timing aligned with the drifting hull. Cal said they should return to the inlet during low tide, because exposed wreckage might reveal old wiring that caused recent broadcasts. Evan agreed, though, his stomach tightened because the voice spoke with increasing clarity each time. They secured the skiff, then returned that afternoon when the tide receded and revealed dark shapes below the bend. They anchored near a shallow patch where twisted metal poked through sand like remnants from the storm. Evan moved closer and saw part of a radio panel caught between two rusted beams with wires trailing into the water. Cal used a long hook to lift a loose section and found a corroded tag that matched the radio model used on Reed's crew during 2017. The radio crackled at that moment, then delivered another faint call of Evan's name, with a tone that now carried slow, rising static. Cal recorded the sound while Evan watched the wires shift with the gentle pull of the tide. He understood then that the wrecked panels sometimes connected when saltwater reached the exposed terminals, which created a short burst of power. The burst likely triggered fragments of an old emergency recording that captured voices during the storm. Evan remembered that some crews recorded internal chatter before impact, and those recordings sometimes contained rushed calls that repeated crew names. The voice in his radio may have been part of that final chatter, which echoed through damaged wiring each time conditions aligned. They brought the recording to the dispatcher, who played it through a clearer speaker. The voice echoed sharply, then faded as the static rose, which made the source obvious. It was a broken emergency loop that repeated fragments from a doomed crew's final minutes. The distorted tone made the calls sound directed, but they were simply names, shouted during chaos. Evan felt a heavy release of tension because the mystery carried a painful answer, but at least it was grounded in something real. He asked the dispatcher to contact local authorities so they could mark the wreck and prevent more confusion. Cal agreed and said the inlet should be flagged on new charts for safety. Evan returned to the water the next day and listened to his radio with a calmer mind while checking his crab pots. The inlet felt different because he now understood the source, even though the memory of the voice still lingered. He looked toward the bend where the wreck rested and thought about the crew who never returned. He continued working that season with new respect for the signals that travel across water because each transmission carried a story shaped by time and tide. He did not hear his name again and believed the loop finally failed after years of corrosion. He kept the recording in a drawer at home to remind himself that strange moments sometimes come from simple causes. He knew that calm days on the inlet now carried a quiet steadiness that felt earned after weeks of searching for answers. The stories? A camper's forgotten tape exposed the real reason they closed the park. The old park had been shut for years after a string of unexplained incidents that locals still mentioned in quiet tones. The only solid clue ever discussed came from a small camcorder tape found inside a forgotten overnight pack near the North Trail. The story followed a 26-year-old school technician named Lyle Rooker, who visited the park in early autumn of 2019. He worked long weeks in a crowded lab and wanted one quiet weekend before the winter rush returned. He drove out early on a Friday, hoping to film some wildlife and maybe catch a quiet sunrise near the ridge. Lyle picked a simple loop near a small lake and planned to reach a clearing before dark so he could set up his camp. He checked the weather, loaded his pack, then started the trail with a relaxed pace that matched the quiet feel of the woods. The place had been thinning in visitors for years, and he enjoyed the stillness while he walked toward the lake. The incident started when he noticed a narrow side path marked only by faded blue tape tied around a leaning pine. He looked at his printed map and saw no hint of that path, even though it seemed recently used by something heavy. The ground showed deep impressions and a few dragged lines that he could not match with normal hiker traffic. Lyle moved closer to inspect the impressions, and he recorded a brief clip while he knelt near the dirt with the camcorder. Witness statements later noted that his voice sounded uneasy when he said he might return later to check the full length of the side path. He continued toward the lake, though he kept glancing back with a nervous expression that showed in later recovered frames. When he reached the clearing, he met a retired ranger named Colton Reeves, who often walked the trail for exercise. Colton warned him about stray dogs reported near the ridge and advised him to stay on the main path if he heard anything heavy moving. Lyle agreed, though he mentioned the strange impressions near the pine. Colton seemed unsettled by that detail and said he had not seen blue tape in that area before. That short exchange later became an important piece of the investigation because Colton described Lyle as alert and fully oriented. Dispatch logs showed that the ranger left the clearing around the same time Lyle began setting up his small tent beside the lake. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, and he recorded a simple note saying he would return home early Sunday. The complication began when distant knocks echoed across the water after sunset. The tape captured 3 sharp hits, followed by a slow dragging sound that rolled through the trees. Lyle whispered a short question, asking if someone was swinging tools, but no voice answered before the sound faded. He stepped outside with the camcorder, and the footage trembled slightly while he walked toward the shoreline. That part of the tape showed ripples moving across the lake, though the surface looked calm seconds earlier. A dim shape crossed from right to left near the far bank, but the frame blurred before any exact detail formed. Investigators later judged the shape to be human-sized, though they could not confirm height or posture. Lyle backed away, and he ended the clip with a quick excuse that he needed more light. Evidence gathered from his tent indicated he tried to sleep but stayed awake most of the night. His pack remained open, and he had placed the camcorder near the entrance so he could reach it quickly. Around 2 in the morning, a second set of knocks started. The tape recorded them with clearer tone, and they sounded closer to the clearing than before. Lyle stepped out and aimed the camcorder toward the trees near the side path. The audio picked up cracking undergrowth along with short breaths that suggested he was frightened, yet still curious enough to film. Then a faint voice appeared near the edge of the microphone range. The voice asked if anyone had seen the dog from the ridge and repeated the question twice. Investigators matched the voice to a missing hiker reported 3 seasons earlier, according to archived calls. That hiker had vanished during a late storm near the North Trail, and his final message referenced a stray dog that followed him across the ridge. The match was considered probable, though never confirmed, because the audio was worn with age. Lyle walked a few steps toward the sound, though he kept enough distance for a quick retreat. The tape showed a tall figure standing between 2 pines with an odd tilt at the shoulders. The figure swayed slowly, as if injured, and the lower right side appeared fixed in a stiff angle. Lyle asked if the person needed help. The voice did not answer, and the figure moved further into the trees without showing its face. The investigation deepened when rangers found Lyle's camp untouched the following afternoon, with his tent still upright and his food sealed. His phone lay inside the tent with 2 attempted calls made around 3 that morning. The calls never connected due to weak signal. The camcorder was found near the base of the leaning pine where the faint blue tape had been tied. Search teams followed the side path and found more deep impressions along with a torn jacket fragment that matched the missing hiker's clothing from 3 seasons earlier. The fragment was caught on a low branch roughly 20 yards from where Lyle recorded the swaying figure. Soil samples indicated repeated movement through that area, though not enough to identify specific tracks. The twist emerged when investigators compared Lyle's final clip with an older wildlife survey recorded 6 years earlier. Both clips captured the same faint voice asking about the dog near the ridge. The survey team noted the voice, but assumed it came from campers beyond the tree line. The match suggested a pattern of someone or something calling from the same area across multiple years. The official report stated that the park remained unsafe due to unstable terrain near the North Trail and ongoing search efforts tied to older missing persons cases. Unofficially, several rangers believed the repeated voice signaled a person who wandered off the main path and survived through unknown means. They felt the figure avoided help and followed hikers who entered the side path after dark. Lyle was never found despite extensive searches that covered every marked route and several unmarked stretches. His camcorder tape became the final recorded clue, showing his calm approach that shifted to rising fear as the figure moved away. The park closed soon after officials reviewed the tapes and compared them with archived survey audio. The case left a quiet note in local reports, stating that people sometimes leave trails for reasons no one fully understands. The forgotten tape remained the clearest glimpse into those final hours, and it shaped the quiet acceptance that the park would not reopen in the near future. The closing line on the internal report stated that some paths stay hidden for good reasons, and not every question finds a safe answer. The stories. This park bench became the key to 5 disappearances. In many archived reports tied to a quiet suburban trail, one park bench kept showing up in every witness statement. The bench sat beside an older walking path that locals used for years, and it became the center of a strange pattern tied to 5 missing people. The story followed a 34-year-old technician named Braden Lyle, who lived a few miles from the park. He worked maintenance shifts at a small distribution center, and he often stopped by the trail after long nights on the floor. He used the spot to unwind and clear his head before heading home. His goal that morning in early autumn of 2021 was simple. He planned to sit for a few minutes and send a short message to his sister who had been asking about a ride the following weekend. Braden parked near the first turnoff, and he walked toward the bench while thinking about breakfast. The path was empty that morning, and the air felt colder than it usually did. He reached the bench, and he set his bag down while noticing fresh flowers near the base. He had seen flowers there before, but usually only 1 or 2. That morning, he counted 3 bunches, and each looked recently placed. He sat and opened his phone, and that was when he heard a faint snap behind him. He turned, but saw no one on the path. He listened for a moment, and he heard what sounded like quiet breathing near the small cluster of trees. He stood and called out a simple greeting, and he waited without moving. The breathing faded, and he felt uneasy enough to step back from the bench. A woman approached from the trail side and asked if he had heard something by the trees. Her name was Maren Ulrich, a 31-year-old caseworker who visited the trail on her days off. She pointed toward the bench and said she had seen a man sitting there 2 days earlier who vanished after dropping a small notebook. Braden asked what she meant by vanished. She explained that the man had walked toward the trees, and no one saw him leave the area based on her follow-up checks. Braden felt a chill and picked up his bag, and he asked if she had looked around for the notebook. She nodded and said she had found it under the bench. She kept it at home after failing to find a name inside. She told him she could bring it later if he wanted to see it, and he agreed since the story bothered him. She said she would return in an hour after finishing her walk. Braden stayed near the bench and looked around the clearing while replaying her account. The flowers suddenly felt more significant, and he remembered a local post from late 2020 that mentioned a missing runner who often paused near that same bench. He opened an archived article on his phone and saw a blurred photo of the bench with a date stamp. His stomach tightened when he noticed the same pattern of flowers near the legs. He walked closer to the tree line and saw a strip of cloth caught on a branch. He reached up and pulled it free, and he noticed faint mud streaks along the fabric. He placed it on the bench and took a photo for his own record. He had done informal volunteer searches before, and he knew documenting small clues mattered when nothing else made sense. A man in his late 50s entered the clearing and stopped near the bench. He introduced himself as Arvin Drexler, a retired surveyor who lived across the road from the trail. He asked if Braden was looking into the disappearances tied to the area. Braden said he was only trying to understand what happened near the bench. Arvin nodded and said he had seen similar details across several years, and each case started with someone stopping to rest. Arvin pointed to a narrow gap in the trees where old markers hung from metal hooks. He said the markers were part of an abandoned drainage project from the early 2010s. He explained that the project left several deep maintenance pits that were never fully filled, and he believed people may have fallen into an access point hidden under thick brush. Braden asked if he ever reported that theory. Arvin said he tried, but no one followed up due to limited staff and unclear evidence. Maren returned with the notebook in her hand, and she gave it to Braden. The cover felt worn, and several pages had faint impressions of older notes. He flipped through and found a short line written on the last page. It said, "Met them again by the bench after nightfall." The handwriting looked shaky, and the ink appeared fresh compared to the other pages. Braden asked where exactly she found it. She said it had been wedged between 2 boards under the far side of the bench. Arvin leaned closer and said he had never seen anyone place a notebook there, which made him think the writer returned recently. Braden felt the temperature shift and noticed a faint draft coming from the gap in the trees. He walked toward the marked area and pushed aside thick branches. Beneath the fallen brush, he found a concrete lip with rusted bolts. The ground dipped sharply, and a hollow space opened several feet below. He knelt and used his phone light to check for movement. He saw only old tools and a broken ladder, yet something about the depth made his pulse race. He called out to ask if anyone was down there. No one answered, but a weak echo carried the sound back. Maren suggested checking the other side of the pit for a safer angle. They circled the clearing, and Arvin pointed to a collapsed section of fencing that partially covered another opening. Braden cleared some branches, and he spotted a shoe near the edge. The rubber looked worn, and the sole pattern matched a detail from the runner case he had read earlier. He carefully reached for it, and he noticed dry mud around the heel. Braden asked Arvin to hold his phone while he photographed the shoe. Maren stepped back to avoid disturbing the area, and she scanned the surrounding branches for more fabric. She pointed to another strip caught on a higher limb, which matched the cloth Braden found earlier. They connected the pieces and realized someone had likely moved through the gap with enough force to tear clothing. Braden called a non-emergency line and reported the discovery. He gave general details without naming the notebook and said he believed an old maintenance pit posed danger to visitors. A dispatcher said someone would check the site later, though no estimate was given. That answer frustrated Braden, and he decided to take additional photos to support the claim. As he prepared to leave, he noticed the flowers again and realized each bunch marked dates close to older missing person reports. He photographed the flowers and compared their spacing to the article images. The match felt close enough to suggest someone used the bench as a memorial or a signal. Maren suggested the writer of the notebook might have met someone connected to those flowers, and the line about meeting them again could imply repeated encounters. Braden opened the notebook once more and touched the last page. He noticed tiny indent marks above the line that hinted at a torn message. He angled the page toward the light and saw faint shapes. It looked like someone had written a location reference before removing the sheet. He took a close photo, planning to use editing tools later to enhance the impressions. They decided to walk the perimeter of the clearing before leaving, and Arvin guided them to an older fire road behind the benches. The road had cracked pavement and faded tape lines. He said he once saw a person wearing a reflective vest walking that area at night during 2018. He never identified the person, but he remembered the pattern on the vest matched old county uniforms that were discontinued years earlier. Braden connected that detail to the notebook entry and wondered if the writer had followed someone who claimed to inspect the trail. Maren said the county stopped sending inspectors to that area due to limited funding, which made the sighting even stranger. Arvin agreed and said the person may have used an old uniform to avoid suspicion. They returned to the bench, and Braden looked at the wooden boards where the notebook had been found. He noticed scrape marks near the underside. He slid a hand under the frame and found a small metal clip. It felt loose, and he pulled gently. A folded paper slipped out and landed on the ground. He unfolded it and read a short handwritten note that said, "Follow the lights near the cutoff after dark." The writing matched the notebook. Maren covered her mouth and said the message made her think someone used small lights to guide visitors toward the maintenance pit. Arvin said he once saw flickering lights near the cutoff during late 2019, but assumed they were kids playing with flashlights. Braden realized the lights may have lured curious people toward the gap. They stood silently as the idea settled. The disappearances could have been accidents caused by a hidden pit and a misleading light source. The writer of the notebook may have followed the lights and nearly fell or witnessed someone else fall. Braden suggested the writer tore out the earlier page to give it to someone, possibly a friend or an officer, yet the person never turned it in. A faint gust moved through the clearing, and Braden felt uneasy again. He gathered the notebook and folded note, and he said he would deliver them to the local station as soon as possible. Maren said she would provide her statement about seeing the notebook drop 2 days earlier. Arvin agreed to guide officers to the pit if needed. They walked back toward the parking area while discussing safer trail access. Braden looked over his shoulder at the bench, and he felt a strange pull. The bench had been a quiet place for years, yet its role in 5 disappearances seemed tied to simple mistakes, hidden hazards, and poorly understood signals left by an unknown person. The truth felt less like a supernatural mystery and more like a chain of overlooked warnings. Braden left the park with a steady resolve to push for a full inspection. He believed the answers were already there in the bench, in the flowers, and in the fragments of notes hidden under old boards. The truth only needed patient eyes to connect what had been ignored, and he hoped the next visitor would find the trail safer once those connections reached the right people. The stories. The mineshaft everyone avoids after one winter shift. Hushed stories about a troubled winter shift lingered around an old mining town where people rarely challenged its harsh land. Locals claimed the trouble began after a night when a minor accident exposed something deeper than ice inside an abandoned shaft. Ryder Halden was 34 and worked as a maintenance tech for a small mining contractor that handled seasonal repairs. He arrived in the area during early winter to inspect older ventilation lines after a storm damaged several service roads. He hoped to finish his tasks fast because he planned to drive south before deeper snow arrived. His simple goal was to check the inactive shaft called Northcut and file a routine report that usually required little effort. The incident started when Ryder reached the frozen service trail and noticed fresh tire marks that did not match company vehicles. He studied the tracks because they curved sharply near the locked entrance, and he felt annoyed since trespassing caused delays. He followed the marks for a short distance and found the company padlock on the gate sitting open in the snow. That immediately changed his plan because an unlocked gate meant he needed to walk inside and confirm that no one had entered recently. The complication grew once he stepped into the dim first chamber and heard a steady tapping sound echoing from deeper tunnels. Ryder paused because the mine had been inactive for more than 10 years, according to archived maintenance logs stored in the base office. He tried to convince himself that melting ice caused the noise, yet the tapping kept a slow rhythm that felt intentional. Nearby walls held old chalk markings that matched diagrams found in earlier reports, though he spotted one new line that seemed recently drawn. He documented the finding with his work phone because unusual markings required clear evidence for supervisors. The photo captured a faint boot print beside the chalk line, and that raised his concern further. Ryder checked the archived inspection sheets stored on the local server earlier that morning, and none mentioned any recent site visits other than his. He decided to walk deeper because standard protocol ordered a full sweep whenever unauthorized signs appeared. He carried a small lantern since the wired lights no longer functioned after their power source was removed several years prior. During his investigation, he followed the tapping while keeping his pace slow, and he noticed the pattern shift whenever he stopped moving. Ryder wondered if frozen beams strained under winter pressure, yet the sound seemed too controlled to match structural stress. The tunnel floor held dusty rail tracks once used for small carts, and he saw scattered debris that did not appear in previous photos taken during a 2018 inspection. Among the pieces, he noticed a bent metal badge with faded lettering that seemed older than the shutdown date. He recorded its location because older equipment sometimes surfaced during thaw periods, and supervisors liked accurate notes. The tapping finally ceased near a narrow drop that led to a secondary shaft called split turn, according to age diagrams. Ryder checked archived calls from the company emergency line on his tablet because the area once hosted minor cave-ins, and he found one brief report from 2009 that mentioned a missing day laborer whose case ended without clear closure. The record did not list a name, and Ryder assumed it was a typical incomplete file from seasonal hiring cycles. Still, the timing of the tapping felt too strange and forced him to rethink his assumptions about the site. He crouched near the drop and shined his lantern downward, where he spotted a small fabric scrap wedged between two beams. The scrap looked newer than the surrounding decay, and he recognized the color because it matched safety jackets issued during recent winter shifts at the company depot. Ryder felt uneasy because no crew members reported missing gear that month, and the depot logs showed no issued jackets beyond standard signouts. He reached for the scrap carefully and noticed dried dirt on its underside, along with faint char marks that resembled contact with a heated surface. As he studied the scrap, a distant metallic clang echoed from behind him, which made him turn quickly. Ryder called out for any possible trespasser, and his voice bounced through the tunnels without a reply. He replayed earlier photos on his phone to compare debris positions, and he realized a thin wooden plank on the floor behind him now leaned at a sharper angle. He felt certain he did not touch it earlier, so he took another photo, planning to discuss it with security because possible movement indicated human presence or shifting beams. Ryder climbed out of the narrow section and moved toward the first chamber, using the lantern to check each corner. On the way, he discovered a shallow scrape on the wall that looked freshly made, and the chalky dust sat loose on the ground below it. He checked his steps carefully because he wanted to avoid contaminating the scene before proper documentation. He snapped a photo and noted its timestamp for supervisors, who required clear tracking of each entry detail. As he reached the first chamber, the cold air felt sharper and carried a faint burnt scent that had not been present earlier. Ryder scanned the floor for heat sources but found only patches of frost that melted near the gate. He felt confused because the temperature should have dropped consistently inside an inactive shaft during winter storms. His attention returned to the open padlock because fresh scarring around its hinge suggested someone forced it quickly rather than using a key. He stepped outside and followed the tire tracks up the service trail. The sun hung low and gave the snow an orange tint that made details easier to spot. Ryder found a second set of prints beside the tire marks, which looked like boots with shallow tread, and the stride pattern suggested a slow walk. He recorded this because incidents involving unauthorized visitors required complete documentation for liability protection. The prints led toward a bend where the snow deepened around an old equipment shed with a cracked metal roof. At the shed, he found the door slightly ajar and signs of recent activity like disturbed dust and dragged footprints. Ryder pushed the door open and found a large portable heater tipped on its side with a melted patch around its vent. The heater model matched units removed from service years earlier due to overheating risks, and he knew they remained stored at a warehouse miles away. Ryder checked the shed floor and found more scraps of the same jacket material he collected earlier, which suggested a link to the heater incident. Tapping returned faintly from the direction of the mine, which forced him to choose between returning to safety or completing his sweep. He paused because protocol permitted retreat when structural risks arose, yet he believed the evidence required a clearer connection. Ryder replayed the metallic clang in his mind and concluded that the noise did not match natural stress shifts. He walked back toward the gate with steady steps while comparing earlier tire tracks to ensure no new marks appeared during his absence. Inside the chamber again, Ryder traced the tapping to a side tunnel sealed during the 2009 incident mentioned in archived calls. The seal consisted of old boards nailed across the tunnel mouth, yet one board sagged as if recently disturbed. He lifted his lantern and saw soot on the edges that resembled the heater melt pattern from the shed. Ryder removed gloves and checked the temperature of the soot but found it cold, which meant the disturbance happened earlier. Behind the boards, he noticed another chalk mark shaped like a short horizontal line above a circle. He tried to recall earlier diagrams and realized this symbol appeared in a forgotten annex report describing temporary holding zones used for equipment staging. Ryder removed a loose board and peered into the dark opening where he saw a narrow pit with metal fragments scattered along its base. Among them, he saw a torn patch of the same jacket color that seemed older with deeper dirt embedded in its fibers. He lowered his lantern deeper and noticed something else. A structural support beam bore a fresh dent shaped like the corner of a heater casing. He understood then that someone tried to use older gear to heat part of the tunnel, possibly to locate or free something buried under the pit. This linked the heater scrap, soot marks, and scorch on the jacket pieces into a single sequence, suggesting a recent search attempt. Ryder backed away because he realized the person or people involved might still be nearby. Before leaving, he noticed his lantern flicker and then regain strength. The tapping stopped again, which heightened his urgency. Ryder stepped out into the open trail and felt the frozen wind strike harder as he reached his truck. He contacted dispatch and requested a site lockdown due to signs of unauthorized entry and possible hazardous activity. Dispatch promised to send a team after sunrise, since travel remained dangerous during heavy winter. A follow-up investigation reportedly found additional heater fragments inside the shed, along with prints that matched no employees. Witness statements from nearby residents mentioned a person seen in a bright jacket entering the service trail 2 nights earlier. No one confirmed the identity, and footage from an old roadside camera offered only a blurred outline walking toward the gate. The pit area remained sealed after teams scanned it with ground sensors that detected minor voids but no confirmed remains or trapped equipment. Ryder later reviewed his photos and noted that the chalk symbol above the circle matched older maps that marked forgotten test zones unrelated to recorded accidents. Supervisors concluded that someone might have misinterpreted the old reports and attempted an unapproved search inside the shaft. They reinforced the gate and added warning signs that urged people to avoid the trail during winter shifts. To this day, the mine shaft remains closed, and locals still talk about the tapping that drifted through it that season. Ryder kept his notes stored on his tablet because he believed the sounds came from shifting beams rather than any hidden person. Yet he understood why others felt uneasy when passing that trail, especially when winter storms made the land crack and echo in unpredictable ways. The stories. Never take the shortcut behind the closed factory. The old shortcut behind the closed factory had a reputation that reportedly dated back to the early 2000s. Local reports described strange audio picked up by nearby delivery cameras during quiet nights when almost no one walked there. A worker named Lyron Strade, who was 34 and handled maintenance jobs across small industrial sites, first heard those claims during a routine shift. He did not care much because his focus that day was finishing a late repair, then getting home before midnight. His route usually stayed along the main road, which felt safer and better lit. That changed when a dispatcher called near the end of his shift and asked for a quick check on a generator that kept tripping alarms. The generator sat near the old factory's fence line, which meant he had to park close to the edge of the blocked shortcut. He grabbed his tool bag and walked toward the unit while thinking about the shortcut stories he had ignored for years. The generator itself looked fine, though the alarm reset kept glitching in a way that suggested a loose internal relay. Lyron unscrewed the panel and ran a simple line test, which showed steady current without major issues. He decided the alarm might be reacting to stray interference from another unit placed years earlier near the empty factory. He stepped around the corner to inspect the older unit and noticed something unusual on the dirt path behind the fence. Fresh tire marks cut through the narrow corridor that was supposed to be locked and unused. He checked the fence and found the chain wrapped but not fully secured, like someone had looped it quickly without snapping the lock. Lyron returned to his truck for a small flashlight and snapped 2 photos of the fence for his report. He wanted to note it in case building management had missed scheduled security checks. When he stepped back toward the generator, his radio crackled with a faint, distorted signal that did not match the dispatch channel he normally heard. He held the radio higher and listened as the interference grew stronger. A voice whispered a short phrase that sounded like an address fragment, though the last part cut out sharply. He checked his phone to compare signal strength, yet noticed a timestamp glitch on his call log that he had never seen before. He documented that odd timestamp with another photo, then continued to follow the tire tracks just far enough to understand their direction. They ran straight toward a collapsed loading ramp behind the factory that had not been accessed since a structural inspection during 1999. The ground around the ramp looked disturbed, like heavy weight had pressed into softened soil. He decided to notify dispatch from his truck, but his radio remained unstable even after he switched frequencies twice. A high-pitched tone hit suddenly, forcing him to hold the device farther from his ear. When the tone stopped, the radio returned to silence, and his screen lit with a brief recorded notification that did not belong to his model. Lyron scrolled through the message and found a short, archived clip that showed poor-quality video from an unknown camera. The clip displayed the same loading ramp he had just examined. A figure moved across the screen, but disappeared mid-frame like the feed had dropped instantly. He drove closer to the edge of the shortcut and shut off his headlights to see the area better. The last street lamp flickered, producing uneven light over the ramp and fence. He kept his phone ready for an emergency call. He also reviewed his earlier photos because he wanted a clearer sense of the path shape before stepping near it again. Details he overlooked became clearer with a second look. The tire tracks overlapped an older set of boot prints that moved in the opposite direction toward the outer road. Those prints looked narrow and deep, like someone had walked quickly while carrying a heavy load. He checked the soil near his boots and found similar compression marks that matched the archived clip patterns almost exactly. He took more pictures and followed the tracks until he reached a corroded service door near the ramp. The door sat slightly open, though crews had sealed it with metal brackets during 2006. He pushed gently and felt resistance from warped hinges rather than any locking mechanism. Inside, the air smelled stale, and dust covered most surfaces. His light caught the outline of a forklift abandoned long ago, though the tire dust pattern suggested recent movement that did not match the machine's dead battery state. He lifted the engine cover briefly and saw untouched corrosion that proved the forklift had not operated recently, which made the tracks outside even stranger. Near the back wall, he found a stack of handwritten notes taped to a cabinet. The pages carried dates from the late 2000s and documented repeated complaints about unauthorized after-hours activity. One note mentioned an unidentified van entering through the same corridor that created the tire marks he saw. Another described auditory anomalies inside the building, captured by a security mic later removed during an equipment reduction. He copied the notes by taking photos and moved to the other end of the room where a damaged camera hung loose. The camera's data card remained inside, though the casing had cracked. He removed the card carefully and placed it inside an evidence pouch he kept for documenting property damage. The pouch kept dust-off sensitive parts, which might help tech staff recover something useful. When he stepped outside again, he noticed the street lamp flickering faster. A shadow crossed the ramp area, though no one appeared nearby. He raised his flashlight and scanned slowly until the beam caught a piece of torn reflective tape stuck to the fence. The tape matched a style used by highway crews in the early 2000s and had similar aging patterns to tape visible in the archived clip. He returned to his truck to call dispatch again and finally reached a stable connection. The dispatcher listened, then pulled up two old maintenance logs that referenced unusual trespassing during night shifts between 2003 and 2008. Those logs mentioned a possible smuggling route using the service door before the factory closed. The route was believed sealed after the inspection in 2006, but no follow-up confirmation existed. Lyron asked the dispatcher to check one more detail, specifically whether any recent patrol cars had reported activity near the shortcut. She checked and found a brief report from earlier that evening. A driver claimed he saw a van enter the far side of the blocked road, though no vehicle appeared on traffic cams afterward. He finished his call and walked back toward the generator to close his initial work order. The radio interference returned, but softer, almost like the earlier voice had weakened. He waited to see if anything else came through. Only a faint click repeated twice, matching the distortion pattern from the archived clip. Before leaving, he photographed the loading ramp again, along with the surrounding soil. When he reviewed the new images, he saw a fresh indentation near the forklift room entrance, as if someone or something had stepped there after he exited. The shape looked too narrow for a normal boot, but aligned perfectly with the print glimpse seen in the archived clip. He left the site carefully and locked the outer gate before sending all photos and the data card to the tech department. He then wrote a detailed report describing each anomaly exactly as he observed it. His findings matched older complaints closely, creating a pattern that suggested someone had been using the closed corridor long after the factory shut down. The next morning, the tech team confirmed the data card contained partial footage from 2 nights earlier that showed the same shadow crossing the loading ramp. They also discovered faint audio that matched the strange voice Lyron heard through his radio. It repeated the same clipped address fragment that had confused him near the generator. Investigators later checked that fragment and found it corresponded to an unregistered storage lot once connected to the factory by a freight contract during the late 1990s. The lot had changed ownership several times without clear documentation, which explained why no record connected it to the shortcut corridor anymore. Lyron stayed involved through follow-up calls for several weeks. His report became part of a larger inquiry into abandoned freight routes that still carried untracked activity. The case remained unofficial because none of the evidence pointed to a clear suspect or purpose. It only showed movement that had restarted for unknown reasons. He sometimes drove past the site after work and noticed the city had installed better locks and stronger lights. The shortcut no longer flickered with the eerie randomness that greeted him that night. He never again heard the distorted voice or saw odd timestamps on his radio displays. The experience left him cautious about places that looked abandoned but still carried signs of movement. He understood how easily someone could miss tiny clues unless the light hit them at the right angle. Every tire, track, shadow, and flicker had pointed to something real that operated quietly in the gaps between forgotten structures. He still thinks about the warning he heard from older workers who told him to avoid that corridor. Their stories felt exaggerated back then, yet the evidence he gathered proved there was always something strange behind the closed factory. The stories. This photograph found in a mailbox changed everything. The photograph turned up inside a rusted mailbox behind an old duplex that once housed 3 families during the late 2010s. It reportedly connected to an unsolved disturbance that drew police cars for weeks without any formal statement from local officials. Rylan Mercer was 32 and worked as a junior claims adjuster who spent most days reviewing accident photos sent by clients across the region. He had driven out to the duplex to help his cousin move into a cheaper place after a messy breakup that happened earlier that year. He wanted a quiet afternoon with simple tasks that could end before dark, since the neighborhood felt uneasy even in daylight. The plan changed when he noticed the leaning mailbox behind the fence with its lid jammed open from years of sun damage. Something inside caught the light in a way that bothered him, and he reached in without thinking much about it. His hand closed on a stiff envelope with no stamps and only a smudged date that looked like it read 2014. Inside was a single photograph that showed the back lot of the same duplex, with a figure standing near a basement door. The figure seemed to stare at the camera, even though the face was blurred under the bright reflection that hit the glossy print. A handwritten note on the bottom edge read, "He never left," and the words felt rushed, as if written during real fear. Ryland showed the photo to his cousin, who shrugged and said the basement had been locked for years due to repeated flooding. His cousin had heard faint stories from the previous tenant, who claimed someone used to sleep down there during colder months. Nothing in the story felt sharp enough to explain the strange energy captured in the photograph. Ryland slipped the photo in his backpack, then walked around the duplex yard for a better look at the angle shown in the print. He matched the line of the fence and the shadows from a nearby power pole until he reached the exact spot where the unknown person once stood. His phone timestamp showed late afternoon, yet a sudden chill moved through the air even though the day had been warm. He took a quick photo of the canal behind the duplex to document conditions since he handled evidence types for work and trusted that habit. Something shifted behind the basement door, and he stepped back while telling himself it was only loose wood pushed by the wind. The handle rattled once, which unsettled him more than he expected. A neighbor named Corby Henshaw walked out from the adjacent unit and asked if Ryland was looking for the old inspector who used to check the lot. Corby looked about 50 and carried a half-empty grocery bag that gave off a faint scent of detergent and onions. He said the inspector came around every few months to confirm no one had broken into the basement. Ryland showed Corby the photo, and the man stiffened before saying he recognized the reflection pattern on the figure's jacket. Corby claimed the image matched a maintenance worker named Talon Griggs, who vanished from the property in late 2014. According to Corby, the disappearance never gained attention because Talon was young and moved often without telling anyone. Ryland asked if police ever searched the duplex, but Corby said they mostly checked paperwork, then suggested Talon left town for seasonal work. Corby lowered his voice and explained that several tenants reported hearing dragging sounds under the floor during storms after Talon went missing. Ryland listened with growing concern because the basement clearly leaked heavily and could hide debris without much notice. He returned to the basement door and studied the warped wood for any sign of fresh marks that might show recent attempts to enter. A faint groove near the latch suggested someone had slipped a tool inside within the last few months. His job trained him to recognize forced entry signs even when the damage seemed minor. Ryland decided to search public records at the small municipal office across town to see if any maintenance reports mentioned Talon. An older clerk named Mavis Kelter helped him check archived building logs that covered routine inspections and emergency calls. She located a brief entry from late 2014 stating that the maintenance worker assigned to the duplex never completed his shift. The entry ended with a note about a tenant hearing a loud crash near the canal path behind the property that same evening. No follow-up report existed, which troubled Ryland because something clearly disrupted the worker's schedule. Mavis encouraged Ryland to check the microfilm station since older incident summaries sometimes went unprocessed in the main system. He scrolled through grainy reels until a short police dispatch log from early the next morning appeared with a simple description of possible trespasser behind duplex. The log ended without resolution, yet two initials of responding officers matched names Ryland recognized from regional accident investigations. It remained unclear why the officers never wrote a complete summary. Ryland contacted a former coworker who now handled risk assessments for vacant structures and asked if he recalled any issues near that duplex. The coworker remembered an odd request from a landlord who wanted an estimate for reinforcement of a basement hatch rather than a full cleanup. That recommendation was denied due to insufficient documentation, which meant the door probably stayed weak for years. Ryland returned to the duplex the next morning and found the backyard quiet except for the hum of distant traffic along the main road. He held the original photograph beside the current view and noticed a missing gutter downspout that once directed runoff away from the basement. Water had carved a shallow trench that led directly to the exact spot where tenants heard dragging noises during storms. He moved closer to the door and pressed his ear against the wood to check for echoes that could reveal hidden cavities behind the interior wall. A faint hollow sound suggested a gap large enough to hide debris that might include personal items left by Talon. He reached for the handle, which gave slightly, as if someone recently replaced a rusted hinge without securing it tightly. Corby approached again and warned Ryland that previous tenants avoided the basement after a courier discovered an old backpack wedged behind a drain pipe. The courier returned the bag to the landlord, who claimed it belonged to a temporary worker, yet no one retrieved it. Ryland realized this detail lined up with the approximate time of Talon's disappearance. He asked Corby where the landlord moved and learned the man relocated to another county after selling the duplex in 2021. Ryland checked property records later that day and found a short transfer note indicating the landlord left behind several unclaimed storage boxes. Those boxes were marked as low priority during cleanup, which meant their contents might still sit in a small maintenance shed. Ryland walked to the shed behind the duplex and spotted 3 dust-covered boxes stacked under a sagging roof tile that drooped toward the canal. Inside one box, he found scattered papers, including an old shift sheet with Talon's name and a checklist mentioning repairs near the basement hatch. Another page listed a complaint about a foul smell rising through the floorboards after heavy rainfall. He took photos of the papers, then looked up when a sudden gust rattled the shed door hard enough to shake loose dried leaves. The wind pushed a loose shingle that clattered onto the ground near his feet and broke apart in a puff of dust. The noise startled him, but reminded him that the property had been poorly maintained for years, which supported the idea of an overlooked accident. Rylan returned to the basement and used a small pry bar from his cousin's toolbox to loosen the frame without causing obvious damage. The door opened with a dull crack that carried through the quiet yard like a tired breath escaping from a sealed room. A wave of stale air rolled out, followed by the faint scent of metal and wet soil. He stepped inside and turned his phone flashlight toward the far wall where the drainage pipe curved behind a pile of rotten boards. Something glittered near the edge of the light, and he reached down to pick up a crushed reflective jacket with a missing zipper. The reflective pattern matched the same glare seen on the figure in the original photograph. A small utility tag sewn to the jacket listed the initials TG, which aligned with Talon Griggs, and confirmed Rylan had found evidence connected to the missing worker. He dug through debris nearby and uncovered an old clipboard that held one final maintenance note describing a sudden collapse caused by shifting soil near the hatch. It suggested Talon was preparing to reinforce the area before something destabilized the ground. Rylan followed the damaged soil path toward a narrow cavity under the floor where water pooled during storms and carried loose items into deeper pockets of mud. He found scattered tools with dried corrosion that indicated the worker likely became trapped by collapsing debris during heavy rainfall. The shifting soil and poor structure could have hidden the incident from sight for years. He contacted local authorities who reopened the case and confirmed the basement conditions created a perfect scenario for an unnoticed accident involving a lone worker. Officers documented the findings and credited Rylan's persistence for revealing the long-ignored evidence that connected the photograph to the missing maintenance report. Corby watched from the fence with a quiet expression that mixed relief with sorrow. Weeks later, Rylan returned to the duplex before his cousin finished moving in and paused near the mailbox where he first found the photo. The rusted metal still leaned forward, as if trying to offer one final warning about secrets left unmanaged in quiet neighborhoods. He understood now that the image was not a threat, but a trace of someone trying to signal unfinished work. He placed a small flower near the fence, then stepped back toward his car while thinking about how easily small details vanish when people move on. The photograph no longer felt ominous because its message became clear through patient evidence and careful listening to forgotten reports. Rylan left with a quiet respect for the worker whose final shift had been frozen in that single frame.